All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. We hope you're having a great day so far, and we're super excited that you are here joining us today. My name is Patty Bersazidis. I am the Assistant Director of ADAPT. Before we get started, just want to welcome you and also go over a few housekeeping items. And thank you to those of you who are already sharing who you are and where you're from in the chat. Great to see some familiar names with us here today. So today's workshop is about applying a social norms framework to sharing information about substances. And really what it's designed to do is to help reintroduce and reorient you all to a way of thinking about sharing information with you. As some of you would have already maybe attended in our 2023 HIDA Prevention Summit back in October, we released a tool to help folks who are asking us and having questions around how can I share substance related information in a way that will enhance protection, not potentially change perceptions that this must be a big thing that lots of kids are doing it. And so some very specific and evidence informed guidance was created in that tool. Today's workshop is coming at the conclusion of a 6-week campaign where we're encouraging folks to continue to mind the message and thinking about how they talk about substances with youth. And over the last 6 weeks, we hope you've enjoyed receiving a weekly info flyer, if you will, that shares some ideas and strategies for how you can take the guidance that was provided in the tool and apply that forward to the work that you're doing with some very specific challenge items to kind of get you started in that process of applying that framework to the work that you do. And we've had some engagement on that, and we're hoping to have a lot today as well, where you all will be asked to pause, to think through some application of different elements of that tool and apply that tool, as well as the strategies to some work that you're doing, getting started with that here today. So that's what you can expect for today. We have Dr. Jessica Perkins, who I will introduce just here shortly, to walk us through that. She is a social norms expert and co-author of the tool. We will have plenty of opportunities for engagement throughout, and we encourage you to engage in two ways. One is the chat. You'll notice that the chat is wide open so that you all can see other people, the attendees, thoughts, ideas that are sharing amongst one another, and we can see it. And we're going to ask you to use that chat feature for very specific exercises as we go throughout the workshop. If you have questions, it might be easier if you use the Q&A feature and say the Q&A feature for questions. That way it'll help us kind of sift through if the chat's really busy. We don't want to miss something that's a pertinent question in that chat box. So if you could use that Q&A box for questions and then using the chat function for offering your responses to some of the very specific questions that you're asked along the way. Just a reminder, this workshop is recorded. An email will be sent following the event, likely tomorrow, which will include a link to the video recording as well as a resource supplement, which will include today's slides and links to other resources that are shared and discussed today during the presentation. Lastly, just keep in mind that at the very end of the workshop, a post-presentation evaluation will pop up and open for you. And we ask that you provide us some feedback on how this has worked for you. So it helps us know what might be some ongoing needs in this area. If you do indicate that you're interested in receiving them and provide us your name, we'll also be able to send you a continuing education certificate for your attendance and participation in today's workshop. All right. So now I'm very excited to introduce you to our workshop facilitator, Dr. Jessica Perkins. So Jessica is an interdisciplinary social and behavioral scientist. Her research broadly assesses social norms and social networks as drivers of a number of behaviors such as substance use, violence, HIV prevention and treatment, and co-occurring behaviors and health outcomes. A lot of her focus is on identifying misperceptions about health promoting norms within local networks as opportunities to implement norms-based strategies that encourage both individual and collective change. Her research areas include leading a community-engaged, population-based cohort study about misperceived norms and their effects on health health outcomes among adults in rural Uganda, assessing the role of social norms on health and development-related behaviors among adolescents and college students in the U.S., and addressing structural and social determinants of stigma and HIV prevention and treatment outcomes among young adults in Tennessee throughout community-engaged quantitative and qualitative projects. We're thrilled to have Dr. Perkins with us today, and without further ado, Dr. Perkins, over to you.
Thanks, Patty. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to engage with you all in this workshop that's really a follow-up to a number of webinars and tools and events that ADAPT has hosted over the last year. And so this particular webinar, as Patty said, is a follow-up to some emails that hopefully you all have had a chance to peruse over the last 6 weeks that have been providing some tips about how to think about sharing information related to substances using a particular type of framework that incorporates positive social norms as part of that messaging. So today I'm going to sort of give you some background material as to what motivated this framework and the design of it, and then we're going to go through some ways to think about applying it to issues and data that you all may be working with in your areas of expertise. All right, so just make sure we can move through these slides. So as Patty said, there's going to be a couple different ways to engage today. One, we're going to use the Zoom chat feature, and I'm so impressed with all the people who have signed up and have sent a chat along so far. I've been trying to keep up. We have a lot of representation from across the United States, and that's very exciting. Shout out to a few of the places that I've been, so I'll be looking forward to hearing more from you all. And then we're also going to use Menti.com for workshop engagement. It's a little bit more of a diverse system for allowing for some word clouds, some polling, some open-ended question and answer responses. And you'll be able to do so either on your current device, you might be on a laptop or on a phone, and you can use the chat features, or you'll be able to use Menti 2 through your current device or a secondary device by either clicking on a link or entering a code or using a QR code. All right, so to move forward, this is just a little bit of a practice one. So a lot of you have put your name and where you're from in the chat. And so here we just wanted to get a sense for folks, if possible, if you can put this into the Menti and then it will pop up on the screen for everyone. And so you can use the QR code or you can go to www.menti.com and type in that code, and then some questions will pop up. And this first one is, what is your job or role? And the idea behind this is to get a sense of who's joining us today? What are the backgrounds and the areas of expertise that folks here have? So are you working in prevention? Are you coordinating? Are you an educator? Are you a researcher? And so if you could just give a little bit of a description about who you are, that'd be great. That way we can see sort of the breadth of areas that we cover. And if you're having a hard time hopping on to Menti.com and you haven't been able to get it after a couple tries, feel free to post in the chat as well. Menti, the use of Menti just allows us to see it interactively and in real time in kind of a colorful way. All right, so we've got a lot of prevention coordinators. The size of the word corresponds to the number of folks that have put something similar to it. And so we've got a lot of coordinators, programs, coalitions, projects, intervention specialists, marketing folks, case managers, nurses, health educators, community outreach, functional family therapy, health communications. So you can see that today we represent quite the breadth of sort of the arc of prevention and intervention. If we think about prevention from sort of from a population public health perspective, and we're talking about sort of preventing any kind of substance use, really to all kinds of prevention along the continuum of care when we're also intervening with populations who may already be using substances or are in recovery. So thanks everyone. I have a pretty good idea of where we stand today. So I'm going to move forward, and I appreciate all of the engagement. And we'll try to keep these quick and easy to use over the next hour and 15 minutes or so. Okay, so this next round, this one is a bit of a, so this should, if you're still a mentee, this should appear as the next question. And this one is to give us a sense for who is on this call in terms of your level of expertise with talking about social norms or having attended another webinar or gone through the emails. And so, and then also thinking more sort of concretely about today's workshop, because today is a workshop as opposed to sort of a traditional hour-and-a-half webinar. So how much have you been able to engage with the weekly Mind the Message challenges? And then that also provides feedback to adapt and us to think about how we can build on what's been presented today and over the last 6 weeks. All right, so kind of on average, up to the question, how familiar are you with the social norms approach? It seems like on average, folks have, stated that they have some familiarity with it, a little bit more perhaps than less. And that's great to see. I know that ADAPT has put out a number of different tools that have talked about social norms and this kind of approach. And so I think we're really going to try to build on some of that today. And for those of you who don't have any familiarity with it, welcome. I will be giving a bit of a background and an introduction. And then I'll also point you to some tools that can provide some further details for you all to continue learning. And in terms of the weekly Mind the Message challenges, let's see, a few of you were able to engage. That's great. I know it can be really hard on a week-to-week to sort of pick up a new challenge and add it to our daily schedule. And so the great thing about those emails that you all received is that they're still there. And after today's workshop and webinar, it could be a great opportunity to begin to think about, go back to some of those challenges and those emails and to begin to think, how could you build on what you've learned in prior webinars, what you've worked on in this workshop, and then go back to those challenges to see where do you stand in terms of being able to implement a social norms framework to designing and sharing information about substances. Okay, so we're going to move on. So today, just briefly, I wanted to say, I'm going to give a brief background about what we know about prevention approaches, really to try to set the stage for why we're talking about the social norms framework in terms of sharing information about substances, a little bit about social norms as root causes, why do they matter, and then what is the framework? There's 3 steps to it. It's pretty simple. We're going to try to keep it short and sweet for you to be able to remember. And then the process of applying that framework. We're going to offer you some opportunities to really dig into some data and to think about how you might begin to apply it to the areas of work that you specialize in. And then an example of what are some considerations when using the framework to prevent fentanyl or opiate and other kinds of consumption. Okay, so to get started, the first question that I want to sort of raise and talk about with you all is, what do we know about substance use prevention among adolescents? So some of you might have been working in prevention for 6 months. Some of you might have been working in prevention for the last 40 years. We've now have quite a history of prevention approaches. Sort of thinking about this, going all the way back to the 1950s, there's a bit of a timeline here in sort of what has become popular over time. And we finally have enough data over time now to begin to ask and answer the question, well, what have we learned? To what extent do we know whether one approach is more effective than another? And so I'm going to review that quickly to sort of set us up for our conversation today. So what have we learned? So from a review of studies that have now been out there about over the last 10, 20 years or so, looking at some of the early approaches, we've learned a lot about the use of scare tactics and sort of punitive and zero tolerance approaches, information dissemination only, affective emotion training only, and education only. So there's been a lot of programs and approaches that have taken place, really focusing in on sort of one approach, one style of prevention. And it's kind of represented here. And what we know so far today is that they've been pretty ineffective, or they've at least been less effective than intended, even though we've spent sort of a lot of time and money and effort on using these approaches over time, partly because they're sort of naturally appealing to us in an emotional kind of way. However, what we know today is that these tactics don't work, and at a minimum do not work when they're used alone without other sort of complementary approaches. And some of the reasons for why this doesn't work, and let's see if we can get this to, there we go, are as follows here. So when we use scare tactics, and when we think about scare tactics, it's like these scary images, all these negative consequences of what could happen. We're trying to really jar people's conscious to think about, oh, if I use the substance in a certain way, this bad thing would happen to me. And the reality is that people sort of unconsciously or consciously think, oh, it won't happen to me, because consequences are either rare or they're far down the road. And similarly, when we provide information and education about a lot of substances, we assume that people, once they learn something that's good for them, or they learn that something is bad for them, they're going to act accordingly. However, we know that people often don't act rationally. I often don't act rationally myself. I know that I should get 7 to 9 hours of sleep every night, and that I should do a certain amount of exercise or drink a certain amount of water, or stay away from a certain amount of like processed foods or whatnot. And yet I don't do that all the time. I don't act rationally for a variety of other driving factors and root causes. And regulations and laws and policies, they don't always work because, again, people break them all the time and are not caught. And so the consequences are not rare. It leads to this thinking of it's not going to happen to me. And then when we think about affective or emotion training, they're often individual-based approaches, so really targeting individuals or perhaps small groups. And while there is some effectiveness shown from these kinds of programs, they are often intensive, they're expensive, they're hard to implement. And often also, they don't always provide skills-based training. So this provides a little bit more, this next slide, about why we're sort of shifted away over the last few decades, away from these original tactics. So one, scare tactics, we now know, don't actually change behavior in the long term. They might prevent people from engaging in a risk behavior in the short term, because they remember what they saw. But often, that's not going to last over the long term, and those events and imageries are really not that relatable to most people. And then another unintended consequence of this kind of tactic or this kind of approach is that it can unintentionally normalize use. So the more people see photos, the more people see scary headlines, the more it sort of raises that risk behavior into conversation and makes it seem like there's a lot more people engaging in that risk behavior than is actually true. So it has this unintended consequence of creating these misperceived norms. And a very similar thing can be said about info dissemination. So it doesn't actually change behavior. While we know it raises awareness of an issue, and that is important, it's part of sort of a long model of thinking about behavior change. People need to be aware of something. It doesn't always lead to behavior change. Because again, people are not rational. The behavior may not be relatable to someone. There might be too much information provided, so people can't really absorb it. And then also, if people see this over and over and over and over, again, these kind of information disseminations may unintentionally normalize the use of a particular substance or risk behavior. And then finally, as I mentioned, the affective approaches often don't change behavior because there isn't enough skill building built into those kinds of programs. Okay, so that's a very quick overview of what we learned about what doesn't really work or what doesn't work to the extent that we had hoped, going back 70, 60, 50 years or so. Okay, so what do we know now? What is working? And I should say, pause. Many of these early approaches are still popular despite being ineffective or having only weak evidence. And that's again true because we want to think that people are rational beings. And we want to think that when we sort of use scare tactics to prevent people from using it, they're going to recognize, oh, that bad thing is going to happen to me and I'm going to stop. But it's not always true for the reasons I've just explained. All right. So the next question becomes, well, what have the last few decades taught us about effective approaches to addressing adolescent substance use? What have we learned from sort of more extensive research on these topics? One, the effective approaches. We've learned that programs need to be grounded in science and theory-based and developmentally friendly and implement data collection and evaluation processes when possible. The more we know about sort of theories driving behavior, the more we consider developmental ages and sort of brain development, and the more data that we can collect really help us hone in on what are the mechanisms of various effective programs. Instead of it being just kind of an affective choice about which program might work, we can really ground it in science. So the other piece to this is that approaches can and arguably should be multi-tiered, addressing risk and protective factors of substance use in multiple settings, in multiple ways. And so really effective programs have begun to target not just one little aspect, but sort of the sort of socio-ecological set of factors that both contribute to risk and protective behaviors. And then finally, what we do know is that comprehensive evidence-based prevention programs, the ones that are effective, they address root causes of problem behaviors. So it's really important to go back and think about theory and think about, well, what is driving behavior? What are the various factors? And so if human beings are not these rational, logical actors all the time, well, what does drive human behavior? And while there are many such root causes, really good programs try to at least address one or two or a few of them as they begin to design the different kinds of information that they want to share or the different kinds of ways to engage with people. And so that's really where we're going to lead today in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of how to address root causes. And so then the question becomes, is there an effective prevention role for information sharing campaigns and substance use education? Because we know that sort of large campaigns that share information and education are often easier to implement. They target a wide swath of the population. And they can have value in that way because they can be cost effective. They can effectively reach many youth and young adults. However, it's really important to think about, and we're going to talk about this, to what extent do campaigns lead to unintended consequences if we're not thinking about this sort of verbiage and how we are carefully framing the information that we put out there. And so based on sort of what we know today in terms of best practices in science, we know that designing theory-informed and developmentally appropriate messages that reduce the risk of unintended consequences, such as the normalization of drug use, and the ones that address root causes, such as social norms and social networks, and we'll talk about that more, they're the ones that are going to be the most effective. And again, while it's not always possible to design an approach that, sort of comprehensively addresses substance use from multiple different angles, it's helpful to at least think about, well, if we're going to design one piece of an approach, how might that ultimately fit into a larger comprehensive program? And when and how can we begin to think about implementing that kind of comprehensive approach? All right. So that's sort of the overview of where we are today and why we're going to be talking about social norms as a root cause of individual attitudes and behavior. And so this next section, we're really going to hone in on what are social norms, why do they matter, and what do we know in terms of how they can be effective points of intervention when we're thinking about substance use prevention and risk reduction. So I present some pictures. Sometimes we just try to get people to laugh or smile a little bit when we're all sort of sitting and listening together. And I want to step back and say, humans are social animals. We have evolved as social animals. We have evolved to live in communities. We rely on each other. We have extensive social networks, whether we're aware of them or not. We are embedded in those kinds of social networks. And we look to others to know what to do, particularly in situations of uncertainty or when we're in a new social setting. And so who's around us, what we think are typical behaviors, that matters. And even sometimes when we are more isolated or feel alone, we still exist in these sort of socialized communities and groups. And so what others do, that matters to us, that drives our behavior. It is one of these fundamental root causes of behavior. So important to begin to think about, well, how can we use information about social norms and the social networks and the norms that arise out of the networks to inform the design of our prevention programming? Now, I want to step back and say, if you go into the literature or you pick up, reports or whatnot, or if you just hear me talking now, you might be thinking, well, what does she mean by social norms? And when you might hear the term or the phrase used on a podcast or webinar or again in an article, it can be interpreted and defined in many ways. And so one thing I wanted to pose to you all today to sort of help us come together to think about what we're going to be talking about today is what comes to mind when you hear the phrase social norms. You can feel free to either hop on Menti or into the chat. You can put a definition. You can put an example of what you think a social norm is in your community. Just to get us a little bit started, sort of whetting the appetite for what social norms might represent to each of us. Menti needs to be advanced. Oh, thank you. And some of you who have had perhaps some experience attending some of the webinars in the past or reading through some of the tools that Adapters put out here might have a good sense for what I mean when we're talking about social norms. We're going to dig into that in a minute. Reality versus perception, telling the truth, normalize standard behavior, unspoken rules. What's acceptable, showing reality, how you should act, perceived truth, status quo, what is typical. Okay, fantastic. Culture, cultural norms, social norms. What is acceptable behavior? Facts, positive messages. Okay, great. These are all really good representations of what any one individual article webinar could mean when they're talking about social norms. And indeed, a lot of these terms represent ideas that are housed under sort of the broad umbrella of social norms. Generally, social norms are known to be sort of the unspoken rules in a particular community or group or society that governs people's behavior in terms of informing how they should act and what is acceptable to do and believe and support within a given community. That's a really broad definition, and we know, we sort of inherently understand that that can be a driving factor. But how do we harness that topic, and how do we harness it so that we can sort of better measure and evaluate and assess its power as a driving factor and a root cause on things like substance use, initiation, and use and continued use among youth and young adults? So this is where we get into a couple of terms, and I just want to get us all on the same page as we move forward. So thank you for all of you who answered your responses. Now we're going to jump back to a couple terms. And one, I'm going to break down social norms and what we particularly mean here and in the tools that are available on ADAPT's website. First, perceived norms. So if we're thinking about social norms as sort of an overarching driving social root cause, what do we mean by that? Perceived norms. Perceived norms are what individuals, any one individual, thinks and believes that their peers think and do. What do I perceive my peers to do on average and support? What is their typical behavior? What is their typical attitude? What do most of my friends, what do most of the people in my community, what do most of the people in my workplace do? What is my perception of that typical behavior? Now, importantly, we form these perceptions based on a lot of different factors, whether that's media, whether that's what we see on headlines, whether that's what we hear and see in conversation. There's a lot of psychological processes that contribute to us only paying attention to certain things that we hear that might perhaps exaggerate different kinds of behavior. Oh, and I need to start this again. And so I encourage you all now to sort of take 10 seconds to think about, in the area in which you work, the communities that you work in, or perhaps the communities that you live, what are some perceptions of substance use norms in your community or in the populations within which you work? Fantastic. So this is a bit of a different kind of question. So this is all of you have an open-ended response. You can write what you want. And so there's a lot of different things that are going on. And I'll scroll through to show some answers of what people have shown. So the idea is everybody does it. It's common. Social hosting. Alcohol use is very normal. There isn't a town here without at least one bar. The perception that everyone uses cannabis. On the chat, only opioids are bad for you. Underage binge drinking is normal or a rite of passage. My family does it, so I can too. Everyone does it. Marijuana is a bigger problem for youth. So this idea that everyone does it, social hosting is acceptable, it's common, most youth use substances. So these are very common responses. When you go out there, I'm sure all of you have talked with folks out in your various respective fields, that when you talk to parents, when you talk to teachers, when you talk to youth, there's this pervasive idea that like, oh, everyone's doing it. Like lots of people attend these parties, lots of people drink a lot of alcohol, lots of people engage in use cannabis or use pills and things like that. And so the question then becomes well, if everybody, like lots of people have these extensive perceptions, the question is, to what extent are they accurate? Are they true? are our perceptions about what is typical behavior actually, do they actually match reality? And so that's the important question that science has started to address over the last several decades. And so what they do in a lot of this work is we compare what people's perceptions are, remember, at the individual level, to what the actual norms are. That is what most peers, what most youth, what most people within a defined population actually think and do. So we know what is the typical and average behavior in one population, and then we can compare that to what people's perceptions are. And so we can get a sense of to what extent do people's perceptions match reality. And what we've shown over decades of work now is that people misperceive norms all the time, especially when it comes to substance use. And these misperceptions arise when there's a misalignment between perceived norms and actual norms. And that on average, people tend to incorrectly think that negative, unhealthy, and risk behavior and attitudes are common, when in fact, positive, healthy, and protective behavior and attitudes actually represent the majority in most cases, in most communities and scenarios. And we've shown this over and over and over and over, scholars who have been working in this field for quite some time now, that this definitely occurs around all areas of substance use, whether that's related to initiation of use, or intensity of use, frequency of use, bystander behavior related to use. And this happens across all contexts and populations. Youth and adults in all contexts and subpopulations misperceive many norms around substance use. And it's not just youth that think that all their friends are doing it, it's parents and teachers and others that think that all their friends are doing it. Now, why does this matter? Misperceived norms matter for public health reasons. Because one, when people mistakenly think that substance use is the norm, they are more likely to make choices that align with their misperception. So if I think everyone else is doing it, I'm going to be more likely to ultimately do it too. And then perhaps I have that misperception. I think everyone else is doing it, but I'm not doing it for other reasons. But I don't think my positive behavior is typical or normal. That makes me become more likely to hide or diminish my own behavior and protective attitudes and behaviors, which then become further invisible to other people. So it contributes to the spread of this misperception and the idea that people aren't making healthy choices. And finally, people are less likely to speak up when they witness others engaging in or tolerating substance use if they think that substance use is normal in that particular population. So that's why today we're talking about misperceived norms, because healthy and protective behaviors are underestimated and made less and less visible, while unhealthy behaviors are overestimated and made more and more visible, which leads to this harmful cycle we call the reign of error, and it leads to increasing unhealthy behavior. And today, what we want to do is try to think about ways that we can prevent the spread of misperceived norms or prevent the rise of unintended misperceptions that people might have about substance use. Okay, so then the question becomes, what science-based strategy has demonstrated effectiveness in reducing misperceived norms and ultimately in reducing substance use? Well, there's an approach. It's called the social norms approach, and it does just that. The idea behind this is that they identify these misperceived norms, and instead of focusing on how many people are using a substance, or instead of focusing on the negative behavior, which the more you do that, it contributes to the normalization of that behavior or substance use. Instead of doing that, let's tell it like it really is. A lot of these communities have really great positive behaviors that are often typical and normal. Let's focus on those strengths. And so the idea is to correct misperceived norms and in turn strengthen accurate perceptions, which in turn prevent and reduce risk behavior. And the idea and the communications that take this approach is that it focuses on making healthy, positive, and protective actual norms more salient, more important, and more visible to the targeted population, which can include both youth, young adults, and older adults. And just very briefly on how this works, because the DAP has the numerous other webinars and tools that are available, is that one, the intervention. Once you've identified that there's misperceived norms, is that the intervention intensively exposes youth and associated adults to actual positive norm messages about relevant groups. So you want to make sure that messages are around relevant groups that matter for that particular community. And then once people that are exposed to these new norms that are not actually new, they've been existing, but they just didn't realize them, they misperceived them previously. It starts to sort of, people start to experience this cognitive dissonance, which causes them to think about, and consciously or unconsciously, to what extent do my perceptions match the actual norms around me? And if I want to be part of this group, because we are all driven by social norms, whether we realize it or not, we start to change our misperceptions of peer norms, or perhaps we even fully correct them. And then that ultimately ends up impacting either our attitudes or behavior. It can prevent someone from initiating substance use if they become to realize that actually most of my friends are not doing it. It can promote uptake of healthier behavior and attitudes, and it can help others engage in bystander action when necessary, because now they know that most others actually aren't engaging in or tolerating that risk behavior. So that's a brief primer on the social norms approach. And as I said, ADAPT has tons of toolkits and links to other resources that provide more information, and I encourage you to check those out. And you will receive a copy of these slides, so you'll be able to go back to all of this information. So here we are today. That's the background. And what we want to do and think today, and what we want to think about is how do we design information sharing and drug education messages to prevent unintended consequences such as misperceived norms, and how do we promote positive behavior? And before we dig into thinking about that, I'm going to take a pause and allow people to, if there are some questions that have been posted, I can take a couple.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. Hi, everybody. Good to be with you again. You've given such a wonderful introduction, and we did have a question that came into our Q&A box that we hear a lot. We hear a lot, and I'm going to read it word for word because it's articulated so beautifully and represents exactly what comes in from many communities. What would you say, and this is more of a foundational question to some of the early material that you presented, Jess. What would you say to someone who says, my parent used the scare tactics, some of those early strategies, right? My parent used the scare tactics on me and they worked. I never touched a substance. So how can you say they don't work?
Sure. So that's really, it's a really great observation and really important question. And one that I get to when I teach about this stuff, when I'm working directly with young adults and youth. And I'd say, here's what we know. Any given individual, any of these approaches might affect any given individual. Some people are motivated to not engage when they see scary images. Other people take the time to learn and read the detailed infographics that might be presented to them about how various substances work, the kinds of negative consequences that could ultimately occur long term. And that is great. What we present today and what's in some of the tools that are on ADAPT's website is based on what we have learned from studies that have looked across populations. So at a population level, on average, across communities, scare tactic approaches and sort of individualized approaches that don't address root causes or that normalize substance use in some way, they do not ultimately change behavior on average. So while certainly individuals might change their behavior when they are exposed to an event or a scary image or a piece of information, on average, what we know at the population level across communities across the United States and other countries is that those kinds of approaches don't lead to really shifting the needle on behavior change.
Thank you, Jess. And just to mention, another researcher in this field is William Crano. We do have a technical webinar on our YouTube site from him, and he studies groups of adolescents and categorizes them into something like resolute non-users, those who might be considering and might be more likely to engage for certain risk, and then those who definitely more than likely will use. And he has studied this to some degree, and you wonder the overlay for those that say, well, I never used it because I was exposed to these strategies. Would they have used anyway or not used anyway because of some of these characteristics that he's studying? So that's another one that you can look into, and ADAPT is happy to provide any literature on him too. That was it. Carry on.
Fantastic. Okay, so great. So someone wrote, I'm very interested to know what mediums we should be using to share the messages. And folks, I think really want to get into this. So that's what we're going to do. So first, just as a reminder, when we're thinking about how to do this, here's what we don't want to do. We don't want to use scare tactics because again, on average, they're not effective. And again, decades of data have shown this. And what we want to move away from, what this framework we're going to talk about suggests moving away from, is don't focus on the problem behavior. So don't necessarily highlight the statistics of people who are using or the statistics of the negative consequences associated with use. Because the more people see that, the more it makes it seem that actually more and more people are using. So we want to flip the message. We want to move away from those kinds of statistics in terms of flipping the conversation. And then we want to adapt education messages because there is a lot of really critically important information out there when we're thinking about prevention of harmful outcomes. So whether that's about things like fentanyl testing strips, or whether that's about alternative social outlets, or whether that's using various protective behavioral strategies, or whether that's even just informing people that there are new emerging drug threats out there that we need to be talking about for folks who have never heard of them. So there's like these important education messages, but what we want to do is we want to adapt them. We want to think about how do we incorporate the power of perceived social norms into these messages? And how do we design these messages so that they're not unintentionally creating this idea that use is more and more common? So this is what we want to do. We want to simply try to think about how can we how can we make these positive norms become more common in these kinds of communications. And so one, we begin to think about, well, what are the positive norms in the communities? And they can represent behaviors or actions. They can be little to no substance use on average among a youth population. What are the protective strategies that people are using to avoid situations that would put them at risk? What other kinds of healthy behaviors are most people engaging in those communities? What kinds of bystander actions would people feel comfortable engaging in or would support others to do? So all different kinds of behavioral positive norms that we can try to find some data on. And then also we can think about attitudes too. So attitudes matter when it comes to behaviors. And so we can think about, oh, in these communities, is it generally frowned upon or not viewed favorably by the youth to use substances in certain ways? And we can also have statements that are like, we're not going to, most people in these communities wouldn't stigmatize someone for seeking out help or treatment or support for a particular substance use problem. And so there's a lot of different ways to think about including positive norms. And what we're going to go into now is thinking about, well, how do we do that? And so what we are suggesting here today is that you use the social norms framework to design these kinds of information sharing, messaging, and education campaigns. And it's 3 steps. And the details are available as a tool, and there's some webinars associated with it on ADAPT's website. And here we're going to go through these 3 steps. 1, the opening. In designing any kind of information sharing message campaign that you want to get out there, start with bringing attention to true positive norms that exist in your community, such as any local norms, actual local norms, that most youth do not use substances, nor do they view substance use favorably. And here, critically, you're going to want to provide the source of the data, because people are more likely to believe these actual positive norm messages if they understand where the data came from, especially the more locally representative the data are. Step 2, you probably have a lot of information that you want to get out there, or that you're being asked or required to get out there to your communities. So let's think about how can we how can we put some positive norm messaging sandwiched around, built within some of that educational material. And so that's why we start with a positive norm statement or two, and then in the middle, share substance-related information and education, and sort of keep the focus on the positive by interspersing some positive norm messages around a variety of related behaviors, such as alternative healthy behaviors that most youth might do. And again, really critically here, avoid the temptation of highlighting the negative, highlighting the risk behaviors and using scare tactics, because that's just going to negate some of the positive norm messaging that you would be building into it. And then 3, the closing. Conclude with a positive norms message. Conclude with some hopeful statements. And again, provide information on the source of the norms data. So if the only thing that you remember from today is what I'm presenting to you here now, keep that in mind. How can we use a framework? And it's 3 steps. 1, open with some positive norm messages. Then include some of the information that you need to share. If there's like other kinds of education related information that you want to share, don't use scare tactics. Try to avoid focusing on the risk behavior, and then end with a hopeful message that includes some positive norms. And we're going to try to give you some opportunities to practice that today and to show you an example. If I can get my slides to advance. Okay, so ADAPT again has this research available with a lot of details about this kind of framework and how to think about applying it to your own areas of expertise. And here we're going to go through some homework, some workshop opportunities to think about how you might do so on the topics that you're working with in the communities where you are at. So what are the steps to applying this framework? So the framework itself is 3 steps: the opening, the middle, and the closing. But what do I need to do to be able to apply this framework to designing an information sharing campaign? So first, it's going to be really important to identify the positive norms in your community. So you got to find some data. Your organization or community might have collected that data. And if you don't, that's quite all right. There's lots of district level, school level, state level, and national data representing all different kinds of subpopulations by age, by race, ethnicity, by rural, by urban, different places. And so what you want to do is think about your audience and who is relevant to them. You want to find some credible data that represents your audience. Gather as many data points as you can, because you're going to want to think about how to use each of those. Perhaps you might need to flip some statistics, but you're going to want to think about how you can use each of those data points in your opening, middle, and closing of when you're applying the social norms framework to a particular design of an information sharing campaign. And like we've mentioned a couple times, is that the statistics that you find in various reports or in tables or in graphs or here in the news media and all that, they often focus on the negative behavior. Oh, the 25% of youth in this community have been engaging in this form of substance use. Okay, that is true. And that's certainly our issue of concern. But we want to flip that when we're thinking about trying to prevent further initiation or trying to reduce that statistics. We want to say, well, what's the other side of that coin? That means 75% of youth in this community are not using. Social norms, particularly among adolescents and young adults, they matter. So if most people aren't doing it, how can we harness that power to influence others to not engage? And so really harnessing and focusing in on that flipped statistic. All right, so here's an opportunity for you all to do some engagement. So get ready to engage. So I encourage you all at this moment, whether you have data, whether you know of data that you've read reports before, or whether you can pull something up really quick at either the Monitoring the Future website or the Youth Risk Behavior Survey or something about your community. If you can find 1 to 3 positive norm statistics that represent your community or that could represent your community. And if you don't have your own data, check out reports. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is on the next slide is enter that in so that you get some practice on thinking about what are the statistics? Do I need to flip them? What is the new statistics when it is flipped? All right, there we go. And not everybody may have data readily available to them. So we encourage you to come back to this if you don't have it readily available to you. When, of course, you are gonna, spend another piece of your time going back through these slides and sort of reinforcing some of this information.
And Jess, if you don't mind, while they're looking that up,
Yep.
I'm just going to ask the gentleman who put a question in the Q&A. I'm not 100% clear. I'm going to read it out. Maybe how do you address the sources of your data when it's challenged or changed, maybe? How do you address the sources of your data when it's changed? If you want to just, whoever the gentleman is, if you can please put the exact question you'd like me to ask, but I think it's how do you address the sources of your data when they change so frequently?
So I'm trying to understand that exact question. I think there's a couple. I think the more data that you have available to you, the more depth of content you'll be able to share. So when you're thinking about designing information sharing campaigns, often you don't want to rely on like one poster or one text message or one video. You'll sort of need to change them out over time. And so you'll capture more of people's attention if you have multiple messages that you can rely on. And it's okay to pull from various data sources as long as it's clearly labeled where that data are coming from and people sort of understand that they're true and credible and that they exist.
Okay, he did confirm it's challenging. How do you address the sources of your data when it's challenging to get the data from any sources?
Okay, so it can be very challenging to get data. Particularly, you might be working in an organization where there's just not funding available to collect your own data in a particular community.
Oh, Jess, I'm sorry. He clarified one more time. When the data sources are often not believable, it's not believed that they're coming from.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's a really great question. Okay, so this is actually one of my slides later on. This is around the idea of addressing pushback and skepticism. So, and then we get this question a lot. When we share positive norm data, it often like really crashes up against people's really strong beliefs about what is happening in their community. Because we all really want to think, I know what my friends are doing, I know what's happening in my school, I know what's happening in my workplace. And the reality is that a lot of the time we don't know. However, skepticism, pushback, we don't see that as a bad thing. We don't see that as, oh, this isn't working. The initial phase of when people are exposed to these new positive norm messaging, there's going to be this cognitive dissonance. There's going to be some pushback. There's going to be some skepticism. That's a good thing. It means they're seeing the message. It means they're reading or hearing the message. It means they're taking it in. By no means is a social norm message, an approach, and a framework, is it meant to change people's perceptions overnight. This is not a silver bullet pill that's going to just flip the switch overnight. This is sort of an extended conversation. So when there is pushback, when there is skepticism like that, there's a lot of different steps that can be taken, and they're detailed and described in some of the tools that ADAPT has available. And some things are going to be required. Having multiple data sources that all sort of say the same positive norm messaging that most youth aren't using. Having, when you are able to do so, collect data from the community that you're working with, and then go back over that data with them. Show them that it was their own input that created some of these positive norm messaging. Spending some time in small group discussions, figuring out what people's perceptions are, working them through the process of finding the actual norm data, and then comparing the actual norms and their perceptions. That process, that social reality testing, often helps people begin to change their perceptions of what is normative. And so I'll come back around to this at the end, but that's a really great question. We can dig more into it then. All right, so I see that a number of you have found some data where the statistics are flipped. So it's, for example, most high school students agree that it's wrong for their peers to smoke cigarettes. 86% of youth have not rode with a driver who is drinking. 85.5% of high school students in Colorado have not taken prescription pain meds without a doctor's prescription. This is all great stuff. These are all positive norm messages that could be included in an information sharing campaign. And so this text over here, less than half of teens have ever tried vaping. I'd encourage people to think about that statistics the other way around. What that's actually saying is that most teens have never tried vaping. So the majority of them have never done it. And so just starting that conversation with people. And again, you don't have to just target youth, you can target parents too. It's sort of getting these statistics out there in community begins this process of cognitive dissonance, begins to shift the conversation. All right. So, sorry, I'm trying to advance the slide. So when the next sort of step in applying this framework is to begin thinking in a little bit more detailed way of how do we create positive norm statements effectively? What are the things that we know about communication that make people pay attention, that help people begin to change their perceptions? And so one, when designing the statements that you're going to include in a campaign that might have other information too, when you're thinking about what do I need to include in the opening, the middle, and the closing, you want to make the positive norms prominent. Don't make them in tiny writing. Really, have them front and center. You want to use language and imagery that reflects your audience. And so whether it's sort of new common social terms, I often have students that are saying things in ways that I'm not familiar with. So I always want to make sure that I'm using language that is appropriate for the audience I'm targeting. And imagery too, that reflects them, that represents the diversity of the population that you're targeting. And that also doesn't use humor in a negative way. And you want to, again, avoid any scare tactics. And importantly, avoid telling your audience what to do. Nobody wants to be told what to do. In fact, often when people are told what to do prescriptively, what they should be doing, they're not going to do it. They're going to run in the other direction, even though we want to tell people what's good for them. Try to hold back and just focus on telling them what people actually are doing. Use Hol's numbers. Statistics can be difficult for a lot of people, especially when there's a lot of numbers on a page, especially if you're providing other information as well. Use whole numbers. People don't need to know that it was 86.2% of students that engaged in this healthy, positive behavior. They just want to know that it's 86% or most students, something like that. Try not to use judgment language, and then critically cite the source of where you get the data from. If you don't cite that source, people are much less likely to believe it, studies have found. Okay, so now in the chat, we have a couple of folks who engaged with the message with the weekly challenges that were sent out. And so these were some examples. We had permission to share them. And so I'd like you all to sort of think about, and you can post it in the chat or sort of think about it on your own. What do you think of these positive norm communications? And again, these are the kinds of positive norm statements that could be embedded in an overall information sharing campaign, or they could be used as standalone infographics as well. What are your thoughts on these two? And thank you to the folks who allowed us to share these examples. A lot of really positive feedback here. Makes you want to be part of their prevention efforts. I like how clear the messages are. So great, yeah. So when the folks who put these together were thinking about statistics, they really focused on the fact that 85% of youth are not using cannabis. That's great. I think historically and traditionally, we've seen a lot of focus on 15% of youth are using cannabis. And while that's important for us to know from kind of a public health perspective, we don't need to include that in a prevention approach. What we really need to focus on is what most of the youth are doing that's healthy for them, promoting that healthy norm. And so that's great. This positive norm message here is fantastic. And there's not sort of too many other statistics. The statistics that are presented are whole numbers. One thing that could be thought of in terms of an additional suggestion, and again, it depends on the population you're targeting and sort of the literacy of folks, is thinking about, is there an imagery that could support these kinds of messaging that might help the targeted audience identify with the message, what's going to help catch their eye. And let's see, there is a little bit of sort of telling people what to do on this. And so you need to temper. You always want to think about, what do we want to offer in terms of information, like need help quitting, or your choices shape tomorrow, with some of the positive norms messaging. And so this tries to do that sort of balancing act of providing the information that they want to get out there, which is resources to help people stop, while at the same time focusing on the positive norm message. So kudos to those who put this together as an initial, not practice, because I believe they were used, as an initial entree into thinking about the social norms framework when we're thinking about substance use. And hopefully this all sort of, for others, represents an idea of how you all could begin to think about building different kinds of positive norm messages into your very own communication campaigns. All right. Sorry. Sorry, I think I skipped some slides. Okay, so I put this up here as a example of like an effort gone wrong. So a lot of folks, when they're designing these communication campaigns, they want to use humor because like it can lighten the situation when we're talking about sensitive or really tough risk behavior type of stuff. And so they think about, oh, well, I can flip the statistic. I know what the positive norm is. And so it's a little bit unclear, but down here it says, over a majority of students drink 4 or fewer drinks when they go out to party. That's good. So they're not binge drinking. But then it's paired with this image that totally negates that positive norm statistic. And so, I give credit to Bill Young for this image and sharing this in a prior webinar a couple years ago. But what we really want to think about is like, what else are we including when we're designing these messages? And so people like to use humor, but be careful. You don't want to use humor that's a quote unquote a clever pun that could ultimately negate your messaging. So we encourage people to sort of pilot test, to reach out to others who are informed in the way that social norms work and what this approach is and what ultimately this framework is, so that you can begin to really sort of carefully consider the ideas that you might put together. All right. So yes, somebody wrote, people are only going to remember that crack. So one thing that's really important is if you were to show an image or a poster or something like this, that first of all, the positive norm statistic is at the bottom of the poster. It's small, it's not highlighted or prominent. So that's one thing you want to avoid, is really make sure that the positive norm statistic is much more clearly emphasized. And then that's the thing you want people to remember, not the humor that might be represented in an image or video. All right, so here's one more example. And so, I'd like you to put into the chat, how could you turn this graphic into a positive norm communication? What could be added? What could be changed? What could be improved? What is good about this graphic? Great, so okay, pleasing to look at. Yeah, so it's not as crowded as some other infographics are. Flip the statistic, right? So what this poster is saying is that the percentage of high school youth reporting 30-day use of alcohol decreased from 41% to 16%. So like that's great. Fewer youth are using. But what do we want to do? We want to focus on the positive. We want to flip the statistics to say that like, hey, the percentage of youth not using alcohol has increased from 60% in 2013 to 84% or 83% in 2019. So one, flip the statistic, focus on the positive behavior, and then also in helping people sort of quickly interpret and read, especially if they're just kind of running by a poster, use those rounded statistics, so it's easier to take in. And then also what can be helpful too, and what we know from emerging science is that if we also know that positive norms are trending upwards, actually visually showing that. So saying like this healthy behavior is becoming more and more popular, that trending norm, like highlighting that, visually showing that for people can also be another way of highlighting and making the positive norms more salient. Right, and then someone also wrote, don't use beer bottles to show an increase in non-use though. Showing beer bottles and the changing levels, that kind of gives a misleading interpretation. Wait, are more students drinking or are they not drinking? And so what are some other visual images that could be used to really highlight the increasing percentage of youth who are not engaging in alcohol use? Okay, great. Fantastic. Thank you for all this feedback. So I encourage you all now, as you go out into your communities, there are posters like this everywhere, whether it's about substance use or gun violence, or I do a lot of work around engaging in HIV prevention. There's a lot of posters out there that provide statistics, that provide information, that might use imagery, and I encourage you to take 5 seconds to stare at one of these communications to think, how have they provided the statistic? Is it focused on the negative? Is it focused on the positive? Is the imagery helping? Is it not? What are some pieces of information that are supporting the positive norm? And once you begin to build this into your practice of looking at communications, you'll start to do it automatically, and it'll help you in thinking about the design of your own information campaigns. All right, so again, applying the 3-step framework. Here it is again, the opening, positive norm statistic or two, the middle, any additional educational helpful information, perhaps about resources that you want to include, bystander behavior action, things like this, and then conclude with a final positive norms message. And again, we're really thinking about trying to flip the conversation from focusing on the negative behaviors and outcomes to focusing on what are the positive norms and strengths in the communities that you're working in. So here's sort of the bulk of practice. I'm going to give you all a couple minutes. And what I would like you to do is think about what could be an opening, a middle, and a closing statement on a communication that you might want to include for your community. So I encourage you now to take a few minutes to develop a rough draft idea about a substance-related communication that shares important information about whatever substance or behavior that you're interested in, and say it in a way that's neutral and it conveys the information. And then ultimately it ends by framing that message with a positive opening and closing message. So I encourage you to take a few minutes to think about that now. You might have some statistics handy that represent your community. You might have some national statistics handy. You might have seen others from others' communities. I want you to at least work with that data for a few minutes to think about what could be a closing, an opening statement. Sorry, an opening, a middle, and a closing. Let's get them in the right order. An opening, a middle, and a closing statement that could encompass or sort of represent the framework, the backbone of the information sharing campaign, whether you want to focus on fentanyl or opiates or other emerging issues. So you can take some time to do that. And then when you've been able to put something rough draft together, and it doesn't need to be perfect, the key to building this framework into your communications and your information sharing is to work on it, to rough draft, to pilot test it, to get some feedback, reach out to ADAPT for their feedback, reach out to other scholars like myself and others, and we're all working with ADAPT who are, who have spent decades working on creating messages like this. We're all happy to help. It takes practice. And it takes time to educate others with whom you might be working about the importance of social norms, about the importance of misperceived norms, and how to flip statistics to really focus on those positive norms. And Laura, if there are other questions that have come up, I'm happy to address them as well.
Thank you, Jess. None have come up at this time.
I know this is a bit more of a deeper ask. This is where we encourage you to think about this hour and a half that you're spending with us as more of a workshop and less of a webinar at this point. Really challenging you to think about how could you take some of the statistics that you know represent your community and focus on the positive and string them together to represent the background of a social norms framework to sharing information about that particular issue. Awesome. Kudos to the first person to share. And again, this is anonymous. So when you're sharing on Menti, I can't see who's sharing what. So it takes away some of the social pressure of making sure that things are perfect. And by no means do they have to be. So Tulsa Metro residents are fighting opiates with 92% being non-medical use opiate free. That's awesome. 8 out of 10 GRHS students choose not to vape or use e-cigarettes with nicotine. 8 out of 10 teens in Oswego County choose not to vape. What's your reason for not vaping? That's great. What are What are those drivers that are driving that vaping? What might be some protective strategies? Let's highlight those. Can't see behind that one. Most students don't use marijuana. 76% of seniors in Perry County have never used marijuana from this survey. So that's great. I like this. This is great too. You included where the data come from. So that's a great reminder to everyone. When you are designing these kinds of positive norm messages and you're thinking about putting them in, any of these could be used as an opening statement. They could be sprinkled throughout other information. They could be used as part of a closing statement. Always remember to include where you get your data from. If you don't include that point, people are not going to believe it. Less than 1 in 20 high school students use a cigarette in the last month. That means the vast majority are not using cigarettes every month. So flip the statistic, focus on what are most not doing. Most are not engaging in the cigarette use. Cigarette use, we know, does go up with each grade. And so that's why it's so important for parents to keep talking. That's right. So what are some ways that we can focus on saying, so like most parents support talking about these issues. Most students in most of these grades are not engaging in cigarette use. Or, sometimes there might be some communities in which a substance use behavior, particularly if it's like among seniors in high school or college student settings where a particular substance use behavior is the norm. Then we go and we look at attitudes, because most of the time when we're thinking about attitudes, if we're asking people, do you support this high-risk substance use behavior? They're like, oh, no, 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 I would, engage to help a friend from stopping that kind of behavior. So you can use statistics, positive norm statistics about attitudes in places where perhaps the normative behavior does represent the risk behavior. Awesome. Okay. Let's see in the chat. Care County 4-H Club is substance free. Reasons we stay healthy. We love our animals. We love school. We love our family. That's great. And then if you're able to pair that with a statistic indicating that most are substance free in some way, that'll probably make it even stronger and then indicate where you get the data from. 86% of teens in St. Lucie County have made the choice to love their brains and not use alcohol or illicit drugs. Fantastic. According to PACE data, most students reject drug and alcohol use in Chester County than in surrounding counties. So this is kind of an attitudinal norm that could be included. According to Montana Youth Risk Survey, 68% of Montana youth don't drink alcohol. Be Montana strong and standing up against youth substance. These are all great positive norm messages that could be included and sprinkled in throughout an information sharing campaign. So some positive norm messages about behavior, some positive norm messages about tolerance or acceptance or support, and then perhaps, certain data sets. We're finally starting to collect more and more data on the use of protective behavioral strategies, on the use of different bystander action, on support for bystander action. So we can also include some statements like that. And what I want to do now is move on to give you a couple of examples now of a campaign that has applied this norm framework to thinking about how do we talk about fentanyl use and opiates. Laura, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just real quick as you transition, quick question around, would asking, are you a part of that percentage, be good to add, or would you consider that risky?
So that's a great question. And it depends on what percentage you have out there and what other sort of information that is available. So if you have a statistic that's something like, 87% of students are choosing not to vape cannabis, in this school. And you have a question that's like, are you a part of that? That's probably fine. But if you have a statistic that says, 13% of students are choosing to use cannabis and you're asking them, do you want to be a part of that or not? You're asking them to focus on the behavior. So again, you want to make sure that however you phrase your questions, your other information, and the positive norm statistics, it's all really focused around what is the health promoting behavior? What is the social norm that you want people to sort of become, that you want people to sort of drive their own behavior? And then again, there's also can be other statements included that can be supportive of helping others who do use perhaps to stop using or to help prevent harmful outcomes. So there's always going to be while it might be rare or might represent the minority of students, there are going to be students who do use a substance. And so how can we not isolate those kinds of students? Well, we can use statements like, most students at this school would support someone to seek help. Most students at this school would talk to a friend if they, trying to say, hey, let's not go do that risk behavior. Let's go participate in this other thing to try to prevent them from initiating or from engaging in further use. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can think about sort of preventive bystander engagement and interaction to help those perhaps who are using reduce their use, or if they're going to use, perhaps reduce the risk of harmful outcomes that might arise when use does occur. And we're actually going to talk about that a little bit. For example, thinking about fentanyl use, or really when it comes to fentanyl, thinking about the use of pills that are not prescribed to people, thinking around statements that are like, most people in this community would support somebody to intervene with Narcan. Most students are interested in finding out where and how to use fentanyl strips and where you can get them, things like that. So we're talking a little bit about fentanyl use because it's been in the papers a lot. There's a lot of scary ads, and it's important. Opioid and opiate deaths have skyrocketed. But again, that's not the piece that we want to focus on in this particular kind of framework. And so we do want to acknowledge that fentanyl use is dangerous and highly lethal. However, at the same time, it's also extremely rare. And while the presence of fentanyl and other drugs has increased dramatically, it's really around unintentional consumption that has led to the use of a lot of opiate deaths, and it's gone up primarily through the use of pills. Okay. So here's an example of how to think about sharing information about pill use through this framework to prevent unintended fentanyl consumption. So an example addressing fentanyl is Colorado Connects, and I'm going to show some of those messages in a minute. But we want to acknowledge that fentanyl is a relatively new concern. And so many information sharing materials have been developed at local and national levels as part of a concerted effort and an urgency to address what is going on with the opioid epidemic. And so we're starting to think about, well, are those information sharing campaigns effective? Are they unintentionally giving rise to unintended consequences, such as increasing misperceived norms that pill use and other kinds of opiate-related drug use is common? And what can we do to try to prevent that? We don't have decades worth of science yet, but what we do know is that we do know that social norms matter, and we do have science saying that we can try to prevent the rise in misperceptions to ultimately help increase health promoting behavior. And so what we want to focus on, it's changed, is that we want to make sure when we are designing these opiate and fentanyl related information sharing infographics and videos and things like that, is that we want to try to collect data around it. So data perhaps not just around awareness, are people aware that this drug exists or how it works or the negative consequences associated with it, but also are people aware of the positive norms that like most students are not using. And so we want to be collecting data on perceptions before and after we use these kinds of information sharing techniques. So here's what we know. We know that public conversation increases when a new drug appears in the scene. So a lot more folks are talking about fentanyl and prescription pills and things like that now than they ever used to. And in so doing, this conversation can contribute to creating misperceived norms, particularly when it appears in the news a lot if there's sort of a string of deaths or horrible outcomes. But we can apply this framework that we talked about today to support preventing unintended consequences and harm when we're talking about new emerging threats, such as fentanyl. So here are some examples now of a group in Colorado, the state of Colorado, that has done this. First, one suggestion can be focus on non-use norms of prescription pills. You can focus on the attitude, the positive norm attitude, focus on disapproval of use norms. So for example, most youth do not take pills not prescribed to them. Most youth do not approve of friends taking pills in ways that a doctor has not prescribed. And so here's the example that appears on this website. It's the Connect Effect. And so there's messages with a diversity of people represented in photos. We're saying the reality is that most teens aren't using pills that aren't prescribed to them. And they provide the source of the data. And most say that they would act to stop a friend from taking a pill that could contain fentanyl. And so that's both a behavioral positive norm that's presented, And then there's this sort of supportive bystander action that's also presented in cases where other friends might be thinking about using. And so what we can also talk about in an information sharing campaign is that we can present norms about use of pills in specific approved circumstances. So when is it okay to do so? And when is it not? So most youth do not use pills that were not prescribed by a doctor, nurse, parent, or guardian. We want to focus on that. Most youth take pills only in the way prescribed by a doctor. Reinforce that. So instead of talking about, oh, youth are getting pills off the internet or youth are getting pills from their friend and using them, while that does occur and that is problematic and that is what leads to negative outcomes, we want to focus on the fact that that kind of behavior is actually rare. So and instead of sort of stigmatizing people for what they might be engaging in, that might be this rare, risky behavior, let's simply talk about what most youth are not doing. They're not using pills that are not prescribed to them. And most youth are not taking pills that weren't given to them by a doctor or a parent. And they only get pills from a pharmacy through their own prescription. And that's very true. It's the vast majority of youth. And then most youth listen to their parents about when and how to take prescribed medication. So in thinking about data collection, another important source of data collection could be from adults that are associated with youth, such as teachers, coaches, parents. How are most teachers, coaches, and parents thinking and talking about these issues with their children? Would most support having conversations like this? And so Colorado Connect looked at some of this data and they suggested, hey, start the conversation about pills and fentanyl. It turns out that most youth are listening. Most teens say they trust their parents and guardians to protect their health. That's an entree, an invitation to talking about, hey, most youth and teens would feel somewhat comfortable talking about this stuff. So let's get the conversation started. Laura, can you see my screen? I saw someone write in that says whether the slides are available.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, just want to make sure it wasn't a technical difficulty on my end.
Yeah, that's okay, but actually it's good timing. Can I ask you a question? We did. This is a very important one. So you're talking about fentanyl, and you also talked about the three-step framework, right? Which I like to call a sandwich for anyone else that wants to join me in that. But the meat of that sandwich, or the middle portion, the health information, right? The question that came in was related to the DEA One Pill Can Kill resources, which is a lot of health-related information. Can you share where the role of that type of information within this framework that you're presenting?
Sure. So that's a great question. So there's going to be a lot of scenarios where, particularly around like newer drug threats, that you are being asked to or required to, or it's important to get out some of the detailed information around what is this drug? What does it look like? What are some of the health consequences? How does it act? Things like that. And the place to include some of that information is in what Laura is calling the meat of the sandwich. It's in the middle. And you can frame that information with an opening statement and closing statement about positive norms about how most aren't engaging in this risk behavior. But it's also important to acknowledge that that there are in these rare circumstances that people are going to use. And so here's what's important to know about it. And you can continue to sprinkle in, to the extent that data are available, some positive norm messages around, most people are aware of how it functions, or most people are aware of places that you could go to for resources and support, or most people support the use of Narcan and things like that. And so there's a way to think about not just like piling on a ton of like health related information without using any of those positive norm messages. And so try not to use some of the scary imagery and statistics and focus instead on some of the simple facts about it, and then have some of the positive norm messaging at the end and at the beginning. And if you check out the Connect Effect, this www.connecteffectsco.org, there are some great examples of how other pieces of information and imagery and links to resources are embedded within sort of this framework, there's a lot of positive norm statements that are spread throughout this website, and then other pieces of information about fentanyl and pills and things like that, and resources are embedded within and around the positive norm messaging.
Thank you, Justin. If I could just emphasize, the information is important. It is very important. And you brought up that there are so many, there are several new substances always on the horizon that could enter into the market at any point in time and enter into communities at any point in time. And it changes right across the nation. We know that monitoring the data. But it's not dismissing the importance of that information in any way. It's figuring out where that information can fit into an approach so that all of the information together is protective in nature and does exactly what we're trying to achieve, which is prevent substance use and in many cases overdose when it's related to fentanyl.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, Laura, is that building on this, is that this framework is not meant to say, don't include any of the important health-related information or resource-related information. Not at all. This is meant to be, at a minimum, try to include some of these positive norm messages in addition to that information, especially if you need to be talking about the substance a lot. Try to include some of the positive norm messaging around that conversation. And it's really, this framework isn't meant to only be a standalone framework or only have positive norm messaging, especially if you're working with communities who may not understand the drug that it is that you're talking about or the behavior that you're talking about. And so it's really important to think about how could we partner this kind of framework, using this kind of framework, with existing information sharing campaigns, with the design of providing health-related information. Because certainly, getting some of that information out there is really important. And so how can we bring in this framework to help support the effectiveness of drug education? All right, so I think we've got just a couple minutes left. And then I only have a couple slides, so hopefully we're all going to be on time. So one other last thing that Connect Effect did here is that they, the importance of sharing norms about support for bystander intervention in the rare situations of pill use. So for example, you could think about statements and data that represent the idea that most youth would encourage friends not to use pills if they saw someone about to take some pills not prescribed to them. So sort of immediate short-term action there. And then you can acknowledge that most youth are not using pills. However, in the rare cases where people use pills to a dangerous extent, then most youth would support others who administer Narcan to a friend in case of an overdose. And so this idea that, okay, we're not brushing the problem under the rug, but what are some supportive positive norms that we could include in those situations? And again, this kind of positive norm framework is not meant to replace the drug education information at all entirely. A lot of that information is really important, but we would just want to think about how to design these messages carefully. We want to remove those scare images. We want to try to not focus on the negative behavioral statistics, instead provide some of the fact-based health-related information. And then how can we flip the behavioral statistics to focus on the health promoting norms that do exist in your communities as part of a complementary and comprehensive approach to talking about substance use? So here's just another example. 87% of Colorado youth would try to protect a friend from pills that could contain fentanyl. And I think this is almost my second to last slide. It comes back around to what are helpful responses to skepticism for those of you that want to hop on that are still here. Just a quick multiple choice Mentimeter. You can choose more than one. Some of the choices are edit your communication to include substance use statistics. Is that good or not good as a response? Walking through the data and reasons why data are credible. Grammar edit. Ignoring people's concerns. Is that a valid thing to do? Understand that skepticism is part of the process, and deliver a variety of positive norm messages over time. And again, I encourage you all who want to dig into this aspect of the conversation, don't give up hope. One important thing about designing these kinds of positive norm messages is that you really need to educate the team of people that you might be working with on why social norms and misperceived norms in particular are an important driver of behavior, and then practice doing what we did today, like finding the data, flipping the statistic, reading the other side of the coin. And the more you do that with people, the stronger you'll get in your own styles of engaging people in conversation. We never want to say to people, well, you're wrong and I'm right, of course, but we do want to acknowledge their pushback and skepticism and help them understand the data. Let's walk through it together. And then again, a lot of you are saying, understand that skepticism is part of the process. That's great. Think about, can you pull more data sources? Can we deliver a variety of positive norm messages that reinforce each other? So the more you're able to show that these different data points cohere together, that they correlate together, that there's a variety of positive norms, the more people are likely to begin to believe that data. And so you want to help them walk through it. What you don't necessarily want to do is you don't want to say, yeah, you're right, we'll put some statistics back in about the rates of use. You want to try to avoid the focus on the negative or risk behavior and instead keep trying to keep the focus on the positive norm statistic. And as Laura brought up, and as we were just sort of exchanging conversation a few minutes ago, this framework can be, and arguably should be, part of an overall comprehensive approach that offers hope and focuses on community strengths. So really, what are the aspects, the behavioral norms and attitudinal norms that exist in that school, that workplace setting, in that organization, in that community, that we can flip the conversation and really try to highlight as we begin to help youth focus in on, well, what are the healthy things that my peers are actually doing? And how can we sort of use that social normative pressure and the desire to do what others are doing in driving increased engagement in healthy, protective behavioral norms? I thank you everyone for hanging in there today. If there are other questions, happy to take a few right now. Please check out ADAPT's website. There's a lot of fantastic resources there. Feel free to reach out to any of us. Thank you everyone for hanging in there today.
All right. Thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you, Dr. Perkins, for facilitating such a wonderful and engaging workshop. I don't see any additional questions at this time, but if folks have them, you can always email us, and we're happy to get that over to Dr. Perkins to get a response to you. So thanks again. You will see a CE survey that will pop up once you exit the meeting. And we will be following up likely tomorrow with the resource supplement that includes the slides and access to the recording link from today's workshop. So on behalf of the ADAPT team, thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everyone. It was my pleasure.